Our next speaker now is David Miller. So David is a thorn in the side of the Zionist movement. He's a former professor at Bristol Uni, sacked at the behest of the Zionist movement there, later to win at tribunal against dismissal, which is now being challenged by the university. So the fight continues. David is producer of P Declassified, is a director at Spinwatch and an editor of Powerbase.info. We'll put the links in the chat. Welcome this evening, David. Looking forward to hearing your contribution on what next for the left. Thank you very much. Please unmute. Please unmute, David. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So, I mean, I agree with most of what Chris said, as you would expect. I suppose what I think is that these are difficult times for the left, because the experience that the left had in this election was, notwithstanding the successes which there have been, for which I'm pleased, was not a good one, because the left was very much divided, and it was divided against itself, not by anything done by Nigel Farage or Keir Starmer, but by the left itself. So the spectacle of Halima being challenged by 2, or was it 3, or was it 4 other independent candidates in Stratford and Bow was truly awful. And the spectacle also, let's remember, of Craig Murray in Blackburn being challenged by what shall we say, a late challenger with apparent links to Jack Straw, was another example of where there were splits in the vote which were entirely unnecessary. Some of them caused by the left, and some of them caused presumably by external interference. In the case of Blackburn, probably we'll find out that the Labour Party was behind that particular case. In the case of Stratford and Bow and many other cases where there were independents, it's clear that the left parties couldn't get it together. Tusk challenged the Workers' Party in some places, and there was no agreement. Now that's got to change. That has got to change. We cannot go forward. The idea of having unity when parties like that are standing against each other is ridiculous. And there has to be some mechanism for doing that. I don't propose to tell you what the mechanism is. People know really that there are things they can do to make that better. But I would also say that look, the difficulty we have here is in the context of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Now, the reason why there are 4 Green MPs and 5 independent MPs now, and part of the reason why the Labour vote collapsed, such as it did, is of course because of the unremitting images that come from Gaza every day of dead children and bodies and body parts. And so that's an indication, it seems to me, that things have changed very radically in terms of global public opinion, in terms of British public opinion. But of course, we know that they haven't changed very radically at the macro level of the British party political scene. We know that the Tories are a Zionist party, that the Labour Party is a Zionist party, the Lib Dems are a Zionist party, that the Greens are a Zionist party, and actually we could go on further than that to talk about that. So there's a real difficulty in trying to find a way to actually oppose the genocide through political parties. You could say maybe that the Workers' Party is an anti-Zionist party. You couldn't say that, I don't think, of the Socialist Party. I don't think you can say that also of the Revolutionary Communist Party. So I think that there are significant issues there, and the question is how you deal with those issues. Now, from what I've talked about unity and the difficulty of left parties standing against each other, but of course there is also the other question of how do you get involved? How do you become unified with comrades who are effectively supporters of genocide? And that is, I think, what we're being asked to do, and that's a very difficult thing to do. Now, let's take the French example. The French example goes counter, I suppose, to the argument I'm making, so that in the French case, Mélenchon, yes, of course, he has taken a different approach to the approach taken by Corbyn when he was the leader of the party, and in that he sacked, I think, 5 separate candidates for being Zionists, essentially for calling Hamas terrorists, for condemning acts of flood, and all of those kinds of things. And that's I think commendable. But at the same time, of course, Melanchthon is in coalition with Glucksmann, who is not even that much of a soft Zionist, and that's part of the left party. So you've got difficult choices to make in those respects, and I think those choices are perhaps even more difficult in the UK than they are in France. So what we find is that that there are left parties which claim to be anti-imperialist, which claim to be in favour of what is it the RCP says, intifada till victory, but by which they mean a socialist revolution in the whole of West Asia, which would then find a way to create something which wouldn't be called a Jewish state, but which would be sort of a Jewish state. And there's those kinds of difficulties across the whole of the left. And I point also to the newly emerged coalition called We Are Collective, which, of course, as you'll know, is headed by, or is owned by, at Companies House by Pamela Fitzpatrick, and of course, Justin Schlossberg, who, of course, refers to himself as a proud Zionist. And they were supporting a number of candidates, including, at first it seemed, Jeremy Corbyn. There was some dubiety later on about whether they were supporting Jeremy or not, or whether Jeremy had distanced himself from them. But anyhow, that's another issue. I think that the difficulty we face, and this is particularly because of the failure of the Workers' Party to break through, is that the question of who should lead the left going forward is going to be an open one. And I think that we've seen since the election some quite significant developments. In fact, today we've seen some quite significant developments, which I think will affect that. But obviously, the person that people are looking to as a figurehead is Jeremy Corbyn. He's the best known of the 5 independents. The Greens aren't going to lead anything significant, as we should all know. And the other 4 independents, there's various different stories to tell with them, and of course, time will tell how they develop. But people, of course, are looking to Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy, of course, has written this article in the Guardian this morning. And he talked, didn't he, at when he won, about this is just the beginning. But what is it the beginning of? Maybe the next few minutes of my talk I should devote to trying to explain why I think that Jeremy Corbyn should not be the leader of any left unity process. I see that George Galloway has, on a number of occasions now, invited him to be the leader. I think he's doing that genuinely, but I think it would be a mistake if that was to happen. I don't think, of course, that Jeremy will get into bed with George, because that's, of course, not what Jeremy does. I say that because what happened when Jeremy was leader of the party was that the witch hunt against the left, including many of the people in this meeting, really took off only once Jeremy had control of the apparatus of the party with the appointment of Jenny Formby as General Secretary. 2017, there was 1 expulsion for anti-Semitism. In 2019, there were 45. And many people, thousands of people were expelled. We know the famous cases of Chris, of Ken Livingstone, of Jackie, Graham's partner, of course, and Tony, of course, can't forget Tony, Mark Wadsworth, and many others. Now, what happened in those cases was that the Labour Party, or the cases after Jenny Formby took over, the Labour Party set up a committee to deal with those cases. All of the 3 people on that committee had imbibed Zionist ideology, from Dave Rich of the Community Security Trust and other places. And that's why many thousands of people were expelled, quite wrongly, for anti-Semitism, as lots of us know. And of course, Jeremy was advised in that process by people like Carrie Murphy, but also, of course, let's remember James Schneider. Later in We Are Collective, and running his campaign for some time anyhow, was Justin Schlossberg. And what we would have to ask, if Jeremy was to be a candidate for leading any new left faction, is what lessons has Jeremy learned from the previous experience? What the previous experience was that Jeremy didn't stand by his comrades. He, in fact, stabbed some of them in the back, including, of course, Ken and Chris, which is a publicly known thing. And he threw them under the bus, and many others under the bus. And the people who advised him to do that were amongst them were in particular James Schneider, who is his current advisor and who would appear actually ghost wrote that column in the Guardian today. There are extracts in the column which are straight out of Schneider's book. So the lesson that we would learn, it seems that Jeremy should have learned, if I can put it that way, from the strategy of apologizing and moving on, prostrating oneself before the Zionist movement, is that you would take a different approach next time, and you would in fact get rid of the advisors who advised you to take that stubbornly defeatist and defeating approach of apologizing and prostrating yourself in front of the Zionist movement. But Jeremy hasn't done that. He's brought the same advisors back in again, and I think that's makes a very serious case against his judgment. Because what would happen, I predict now, if Jeremy isn't the leader of a faction going forward, that as soon as the Zionists come calling, and we all know that the Zionists will come calling, as soon as that happens and they knock on the door, Jeremy will be advised to prostrate himself, to apologise, and to get rid of the Chris's or the Jackies or the Tonys or the Kens or whoever it is in the future. And that is a recipe for repeat disaster. So I would say that yes, it's obvious that Jeremy should be a candidate for that role, but he should not be given that role because it will end in defeat, even more ignominious defeat than we already had in 2019. If he was going to be a leader of a new left, why didn't he do it in 2019? Why did he wait for 5 years to be expelled and then hanging on all that time when he was suspended and still not walking from the party? If in 2019, if he'd walked, he could have taken 200,000 people with him. Now, what's he got? He's got the Peace and Justice Project, which is, well, I don't know how many people are involved in that, but not very many. So I would say, look, the difficulty is that we have tried that approach. Unless Jeremy now says, I was wrong, my advisors advised me badly, I will get rid of those advisors, and I'm sorry to Ken, and I'm sorry to Chris, then I would say, absolutely no circumstances. Jeremy Corbyn should be the leader of any new faction going forward. That's my take.
Thank you, David. So some clear lines for you there that we should not, or the left should not, work with people supporting an ongoing genocide in Gaza. That appeasement is not the way. And some specific comments on Jeremy Corbyn, I think that some people in this meeting might find controversial. But stand up to scrutiny, in my view. We'll probably have some feedback on that later, and I'd be interested later on in hearing Tony's views on your narrative about Zionism and advice on Zionism to, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, and how we resist that. Thank you very much for that, David. We'll come back to many of those points later, no